Hello my students, welcome back to module number 14, revision procedures. Almost all discussions of revisions tend to focus on the types of errors that the reviser should look for, that are the parameters of chapter 11. But that is not enough. You need to know not only what to look for, but also how to look for. To state the obvious, you cannot correct a mistake until you have found it. It is all very well to know that the translations should have a level of language suited to the readers. The question is, when you notice that a particular phrase has an unsuitable level of language, you need to have a procedure that increases the likelihood, the chance, that you will find the errors in the translation. And when you are arriving at a passage that you think perhaps requires correction or improvement, you also need some principle to help you decide whether in fact to make a change. Noticing the problems in the translation is the most difficult aspect of revision. Revisers frequently overlook clear-cut problems. Why is that? Two possible reasons are they're working too fast and they're not paying the right kind of attention to the text. The reviser's mind may be focused, perhaps to some degree unconsciously, on language and style problems, and the result is transfer problems are not noticed, or vice versa. For example, in the sentence like customers are reminded that the sales of tobacco products are limited to those 18 years of age and younger, you might notice the error in number agreement, sale, blah 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 are, but not notice that the sentence says the opposite of what it intended. Or, depending on your focus of attention, you might notice the meaning problem, but not the grammatical one. The plural verb are is right to the plural noun products, so the error might escape your notice, especially if you are reading quickly. If you think these problems are obvious, keep in mind that you would normally be reading the sentence as part of a longer text, and no one would be directing your attention to it. If you are going to spot errors, you need to be wide awake. It is probably a good idea to stand up every once in a while, walk away from your computer, do some stretches or other physical exercises, perhaps have a brief chat with someone or have a snack. Some people find it helpful to listen to music while revising. On the screen now, you can see the outline for the whole module. There are 9 key points here. Now, let's come to the first idea. Procedure for finding errors. We'll assume that if you are revising someone else's work rather than self-revising, you have already determined who the users of the translation will be and what use they will be putting it to. We'll also assume that you have selected a degree of revision. That is, you will answer the following 3 questions. Am I going to check the entire text or just partially? Am I going to check transfer parameters or just content, language, and presentation parameters? We also say CLP to be short. Or am I going to check any aspects of specifications and consistency? These aspects will often pertain to transfer and CLP parameters. So, suppose you have decided to check the transfer parameters that are in accuracy and completeness, as well as some CLP parameters. In other words, you are going to make a comparative check, not just an or an unilingual trick of the translation itself, the following questions then arise. Shall I check the LCLP parameters at the same time as I make the comparative trick, or shall I make two separate tricks? If I make a separate trick, shall I make the comparative trick first or the CLP trick first? If I make separate tricks, shall I do the entire text at once? For example, read the entire text for CLP, then for transfer, or shall I work a paragraph or two at a time, or a section at a time? For example, read a couple of paragraphs for transfer, then read them for CLP, then move on to the next few paragraphs. Shall I read the source text first and the translation first during comparative tricking? And how many words should I read at one go during comparative tricking? These 5 questions will be considered in the sections that follow. So the first one is one trick or two. One trick or two. If you have time, you could do 2 unilingual tricks. First, looking for macro problems, and then for micro problems. But if you want to focus on micro linguistic problems without getting distracted by the overall message of the text, try reading the text backwards, beginning at the last sentence. So the conclusion here is many of the errors that would have been corrected during a separate unilingual rereading were corrected during comparative rereading. This is, by the way, suggesting that anyone who wishes to focus separately on accuracy and on language or style, and to that end decides to do 2 rereadings, should do the unilingual reading first. If the comparative rereading is done first, there will be a tendency to make language and style changes as soon as they are noticed. Let's look at these questions of the order of reading in more detail. Now we come to the second question, comparative trick first or last. First, all other things being equal, you should read the translation alone first, without comparing it to the source text. A second consideration is a problem discussed in greater detail later in this chapter of introducing errors while revising. And the third consideration is related to the second. Quite apart from your own error introducing tendencies, there is a question of whether the job is one in which language and style are especially important. If they are, you may want to do the LCLP trick second to ensure that you can catch any language errors that you introduced during transfer trick. Now, the first one is one trick or two. If you have enough time, you may find best. Now, one trick or two. If you have time, you could do 2 unilingual tricks. Now, one trick or two, that is the first question, right? If you have enough time, you may find it best to perform separate tricks for transfer and for CLP. The reason is detecting one type of error can get in the way of detecting the other type. For example, you are less likely to spot a lack of smoothness in the transition from one sentence to the next if you are comparing sentences one at a time against the source text to find mistranslation. Unfortunately, even if you do separate tricks of two separate tracks, you may still encounter a difficulty which we call the micro or macro dilemma. Some CLP errors involve just a single grid or phrase. Is it summed right? Is this word combination idiomatic? Other errors manifest themselves over stretches of text larger than one sentence. Is a sequence of tenses right from one sentence to the next, as the interparagraph connections clear, and the headings consistently formatted. You may find it hard to focus on problems of the former kind, micro problems at the same time as you track for problems of the latter kind, that are the macro problems. The micro and macro dilemma mainly affects the unilingual trick, where you are reading the translation without comparing the translation to the source. Comparative rereading, by its nature, tend to have a micro-level focus. Consider the logic parameter. A contradiction may not come to your attention unless you are reading the text through with a specific focus on the flow of the argument or narrative. You are also looking for micro problems of language and presentation as you read along. Your attention may be distracted from a contradiction in the thoughts being expressed. If you have time, you could do two unilingual tricks. First, looking for macro problems, and then for micro problems. Even then, you may not be able to attend to all macro problems at once. Consider consistency of layout. If you are focused on logic, will spot the fact that, starting at the top of page 20, paragraphs are no longer indented. Perhaps the translator started page 21 one morning and forgot that the previous day they had been indenting. This argument suggests that yet a further separate track, but of course that will most often be completely impractical. With practice and depending on your own psychology, you may be able to attend to several types of macro problems at once, or hopefully both macro and micro problems at once. If you want to focus on micro-linguistic problems without getting distracted by the overall message of the text, try reading the text backwards, beginning at the last sentence. It is perhaps worth bearing in mind that there is as yet no empirical confirmation that doing two or more tracks gives a better result than a single track. Many translators are sure that it does, and it would certainly seem that it should, but the whole point of empirical testing is precisely to determine whether what seems obvious is in fact true. One researcher found the final quality resulting from comparative rereading was higher than with unilingual rereading, but she also found during two rereadings, one for each type, failed to make a further significant improvement. Presumably, many of the errors that would have been corrected during a separate unilingual rereading were corrected during comparative rereading. This, by the way, suggests that anyone who wishes to focus separately on accuracy and on language and style, and to that end decides to do two rereadings, should do the unilingual rereading first. If the comparative rereading is done first, there will be a tendency to make language and style changes as soon as they are noticed. Let's have a look at this question of the order of readings in more detail. Now we come to the second question, comparative trait, first or last. To answer these questions, there are three considerations which unfortunately may all not lead to the same conclusion. First, all other things being equal, you should read the translation alone first without comparing the translation itself to the source. This is especially so when you are revising someone else's work, because you have a golden opportunity to see the translation from the user's point of view. You're not burdened by prior knowledge of what the text is supposed to be saying, knowledge which the translator possessed from reading the source text. Your knowledge of the message is coming from the translation alone. A second consideration is the problem of introducing errors while revising. You're revising the text and you make errors yourselves. Suppose you do the CLP track first and then the transfer track, but during the transfer track you introduce language or one of the CLP track, right, errors. So there's no further trick that would enable you to find these newly introduced errors. So it may be worth determining which type of error you are more prone to introducing, language errors or mistranslation. If you are more prone to introducing language errors during the transfer track, then check for language errors last. If you are more prone to introducing mistranslation during language track, check transfer last. Determining which type of error you tend to introduce is unfortunately not easy to do. In the course of revising a half-dozen texts, you have to save a copy of the text after you complete the first track. Then save a copy after the other track. Then compare the two using the compare functions of your word processor. And the last consideration is related to the second. Quite apart from your own error introducing tendencies, there is a question of whether the job is one in which language and style are especially important. If they are, you may want to do the CLP track second to ensure that you catch any language errors that you introduced during the transfer track. Or, of course, this runs counter to the first consideration mentioned above. You will not be reading the translation the way the user will without benefit of prior knowledge of the source text. And the question 3 is if we should read the whole text or if we just should read a few paragraphs at a time, right? Once again, if you want to try to duplicate the final user experience, you will start by reading through the entire translation from start to finish. If you come to an odd passage where you wonder what the source text says, make some kind of mark and come back to it later during the comparative track. If you keep interrupting your reading to make a comparative track, then you may lose track of micro features such as the flow of the arguments. Your attention to flow is going to be interrupted enough, as it is whenever you start to make a correction. The fourth question is to read the source text first or last during a comparative tracking. Here, happily, almost all consideration point in one direction. Read a sentence of the translation first, then the corresponding sentence in the source text. Reading the source text first has several disadvantages. If you are tracking language at the same time you transfer, your reading of the source text may influence your judgment about the translation. In particular, you may fail to notice that the translation is unidiomatic or nonsensical as long as it seems to correspond to the just read source. Reading the source may make you think of your own translation, the last thing you want to have in your head when revising someone else. You should never compare the translation in front of you with your own mental translation. Your reading of the source text will put in your mind the meaning which the translation is supposed to have. When you come to read the translation, you may project this meaning onto the translation. You may not see that the user of your translation will properly interpret the passage another way. This is particularly a problem if the language sentence of the target text happen to be ambiguous. It had two possible interpretations, right? Reading the source sentence first may have the effect of cueing in your mind the interpretation which corresponds to the source, whereas the reader of the translation may take the other interpretation. And another disadvantage is you will not see the text from the user's point of view, or the user will not be reading the source text first, right? The only small disadvantage of reading the translation first is that if the translator accidentally omitted a sentence or paragraph, you may not notice this. Your eye will probably alight on the portion of the source that seems to correspond to the chunk of the translation which you have read. In the absence of large-scale empirical studies of these issues, we must rely on logic, deducing recommended procedures from a hypothesis. One study found that revisers who start their work by paying attention to the translation rather than the source, whether by an unilingual rereading or by reading the translation first during comparison, did a better job. It can't be overemphasized that the two texts are not equal. As a translator or reviser, your product is a translation, not the source text. And the last question is size of unit to reading during comparative tracking. The answer to this question partly depends on individual psychology. How big a unit of text in one language can you keep in mind while you are reading the text in the other language? One general principle does seem valid. Avoid reading a very small unit in one language and then turning to the text in the other language. Such a practice will not give you enough context, and it will increase the chance of your overlooking bad literal translations. Consider this sentence. Given the concentration required by translation and the numerous details a translator must deal with, often within more or less reasonable deadlines, one cannot expect a perfect translation. If you read the whole sentence paying attention to meaning, you can immediately see that something is wrong. More or less reasonable means fairly reasonable, and this doesn't fit. Given knowledge of this topic, we expect to read often within unreasonable deadlines. Now, if you were reading this sentence phrase by phrase and you compare often within more or less reasonable deadlines. To the French solstice, souvent dans des délais plus ou moins reasonable, you may not detect any problem. The match seems perfect at the grade level. Plus ou moins equals more or less. However, French plus or moins reasonable means not so reasonable. Emphasize the negative, where the English more or less reasonable emphasize the positive. If you're lucky, a warning bell goes off in your mind every time you come across more or less in a translation from French, but a sure way to avoid disaster in such a case is to avoid reading small bits of sentences. Now, let's move to section 13.2, Principles for Correcting and Improving. Having looked at procedures for finding errors, let's now look at some principles for making changes as you check. It is important to keep tracking and correcting or improving distinct in your mind. Revising is checking a translation for problems and then possibly making changes. You may identify a passage as a candidate for a possible change, but then decide not to actually make any change. For example, you see that a sentence is somewhat awkwardly structured or not as concise as it could be, but you decide not to do anything about it. It is best to use a three-step process. 1. Spot a potential problem. 2. Decide whether a change is merited. And 3. Make a change only if you deem it necessary. Step 2 is the crucial one. The first two correcting or improving principles will look at concerned cases where you absolutely must make a change. The remaining four tend in the opposite direction. They are variants on a single principle, that is, minimize changes. If you cannot understand the translation without consulting the source text, a correction is definitely necessary. 2. If you have to read a sentence twice to understand it correctly, then a correction is needed. And 3. Avoid perfectionism. 2. If you have to read a sentence twice to understand it correctly, then a correction is needed. For example, if you need to read a sentence twice to see how it relates to what precedes, that means there is a problem of smoothness. Or again, if a passage sounds nonsensical on first reading, but then you realize that the translator's wording could make sense after all, there's nevertheless a problem of logic. For the reader may at first make the same mistake you did. This principle doesn't apply to certain texts which are by nature difficult to read, like the extremely long sentences of English legal texts, often very hard to read. Some passages in a scientific text may have a very complex argument, which you may find hard to follow if you're not a subject matter expert. Try as much as possible to read at normal reading speed in order to capture the future reader experience. Obviously, there are limits. Unlike you, the future reader is not trying to detect problems and doesn't have to stop to make changes. If the future reader will be reading aloud, then read the text aloud yourself. The principle number 3 is avoid perfectionism. As you go through the text, avoid asking yourself, can I improve this? Of course you can, but that is not the question. The question is, do I need to improve it? Not can I, but do I need. Okay, your aim is not to achieve a flawless text. Your client or employer cannot afford to have your revising. You revise, re-revise, and re-revise, and the diminishing returns on revision efforts. Your fifth rereading will take almost as long as your first, but will probably reveal few, if any, errors. What can you do is guarantee that you will correct, free of charge, any mistakes the client finds. Your goal as a professional is to achieve adequacy, a text that meets needs. Perfection is a personal goal, not a business goal. Achieving adequacy is no mean feat because there are so many things that can go wrong and it is so hard to attain all aspects of a text. It is in fact quite difficult to get everything adequate and to do so from the first page to the very last one. This last point is very important. What is the use of a brilliant translation of the first 3 pages of a text if the last 3 contain many errors because you ran out of time? So, do not even think about an alternative wording until after you have decided that improvement is needed. So, identify the need here, whether or not you really need to make any changes, and please avoid perfectionism. Principle number 4 is, if in doubt about whether to make a change, leave it out or don't make any change. In case of uncertainty, make no change and move on. This is a default revision action. Do nothing. Unless new research or newly discovered evidence from elsewhere in the text has revealed a definite error, any change you make where you are in an uncertain state of mind about its necessity is just as likely to make your translation worse as it is to make it better. And principle number 5 is sacrifice. Once you do decide to make a change, use the first adequate alternative wording that comes to mind. Don't be the honor reviser. Don't be the earnest reviser who goes on generating several more wordings in hopes of finding one that may be even better. To borrow from Oscar Wilde, learn the vital importance of not being too earnest. If you've already found an adequate wording, then you are finished. That wording suffices because it satisfies needs. There is satisficing, a combination of satisfy and suffice. So, using the blended word satisfice from satisfy and suffice, you can know what it means, right? Principle number 6 is don't retranslate, and don't retranslate. Work with the wording that is already there. Try to fix problems with small changes, if not, then somewhat more extensive changes. But do not restart the drafting process by working from the source text and inventing a whole new translation of a sentence. If a whole new translation doesn't pop unbidden into your mind, ignore it, no matter how absolutely fabulous it may be. If you are new to revising other people's work, You may find it faster to retranslate than it to substitute your own translation of an entire sentence. But it's important to make the actual effort to solve the problem with a small change. The translator will certainly appreciate not seeing an entire sentence deleted. So, let's write the principle "do not retranslate" on a piece of paper and post it in front of you. Recite it many times before going to bed. Play a quiet recording of it while you sleep so that the idea enters your subconscious. A reviser who constantly retranslates is an economic burden on the organization and a cause of low morale among the translators whose work is being wasted. If after a year of revising others, you are still recasting large number of sentences, perhaps you are not cut out to be a reviser. There are, of course, occasions when, unfortunately, there is no choice but to retranslate some or even many passages of the given text. First, the translator may simply be unqualified. The job should never have been assigned to them. Second, the translator was wrongly informed about the level of quality required. They were working to the informative level, but should have been working to the publishable level. The opposite case is far more common, though. The translator were rightly working to the informative level, but you, perhaps not entirely consciously, are thinking of publishable as you revise. If you are self-revising a translation from your first language into your second, you may find it much easier to retranslate a sentence than to work with the existing wording. When you come across a sentence you have doubts about, the quickest procedures to be maybe mentally paraphrasing the corresponding sentence in a short space, and then prepare a whole new translation based on that rewording. The seventh principle is to be aware of introducing errors, striving to better, of remark what is well. Introducing accuracy errors. As you rearrange a sentence to achieve smoothness, you may remove an important bit of content unwittingly, or unwittingly change the meaning. If at that point you have not yet done the comparative check for accuracy and completeness, there is no problem. But if you have already finished the comparative check, then you have done the worst thing a reviser can do. You have made the translation worse. If you discover that you do tend to introduce mistranslations, you may want to check accuracy again right after you rearrange a sentence, or always do your accuracy check last. Introducing language errors. Language errors tend to be introduced when you are focusing on one small segment of a sentence and you are not attending to the surrounding text. A very common error in English is to change a singular noun to a plural or vice versa, and then forget to make corresponding number changes in words like determiners, this, and it, which may be in the next sentence referring back to the noun you have changed. Another type of error that results from fossilizing your attention is lack of euphony. You change took place to occurred in the Exodus of Iraq took place last week, and you fail to notice the uneven and unintentionally humorous vowels occurred. You may also introduce a language problem while correcting for accuracy. For example, you changed administered environmental management systems to institute environmental management systems. Unfortunately, the sentence as a whole rendered institute environmental management systems within panel institutions with two occurrence of the root institute that have very different meanings. So if you find you are making such kind of mistake, the solution is simple. After making a change, reread the whole sentence and possibly the next and the previous sentences. Another type of introducing errors can be you're deleting too many or too few words while correcting. With the advent of electronic writing, missing words became more common because it is so easy when removing part of a sentence to press the key combination that deletes words once too often, or to select too lengthy a string of words for deletion. Conversely, you may not press the delete keys often enough, or you may select too short of a string of words. Again, the solution is to reread the sentences after your deletion of portion of them. And the last principle here is to minimize corrections of features you are not currently checking. Suppose you are doing more than one check and currently you are checking accuracy. You spot a language problem and decide to correct it, thinking perhaps that you may not notice it later during your unilingual check. Making such a change is harmless, provided that you do not then get diverted by other language problems to the point where you find yourself tailoring and smoothing the sentence in question. This defeats the point of separate tracks. Some people have no problem shifting mentally back and forth from accuracy checking to language checking, but others will find that they miss the errors if they keep shifting their focus of attention. Now let's come to the first section, order of operation. Below is an ideal but very lengthy order of operation for use when making correction directly on computer screen rather than on paper. Such a procedure would be suitable with text that is used for many years or for making important decisions. If you are self-revising rather than revising someone else's work, you may already have made some of the tricks while drafting, and if so, you need to decide whether to retrack. It is also a good idea when self-revise to do an initial spell check to remove annoying typing errors. You don't want to be distracted by the temptation to correct these manually, right, as you move through the text. But don't forget to do another spell check when you have completed all of your revision work in order to catch spelling and typing mistakes you may introduce while revising. So, this one is a very lengthy order of operation. Let's see the first step here. First, read the entire translation for logic, smoothness, tailoring, sub-language, and idiomaticity, as well as those aspects of typography and punctuation which are important for meaning, and any related specifications for clients and employers. Step 2. Do a comparative checking for accuracy and completeness. Step 3. Read the entire translation from start to finish for mechanics, other than spelling and layout, including related specifications, consistency, and any language errors introduced during steps 1 and 2. Step 4. Do a separate checking for numbers if they are important to the message. Also check section numbering for proper sequence and make sure that any references to section numbers are correct. Number 5. Check the document organization. 6. Run spell check function after all changes have been made in case you have introduced any errors. And 7. Press the Ctrl and S combination of keys to make sure that you have saved all your changes. Never forget step 7. It is important in any revision procedure, however brief. Before you print out a copy of the text or send it off by email to your client or to the translator, you must be sure that you are indeed printing or emailing the final version of your revision, with all corrections included. If you print from screen, you will be fine, but if you print or email them from the list of files on your hard drive, you will be printing or emailing the last version you saved. It's not the final version, right? So the best practice is to save frequently. Frequently press the Ctrl and S. You may have set your computer to make a timed backup every so often, but if you don't actually press Ctrl and S combinations of keys, then your final version with all corrections included will be in the backup file, not the main file. Now, very often, it will not be practical to carry out the lengthy procedure described above because it is quite trivial with 7 steps, right? Here is a selection of a shorter procedure. At the end of each, run spell check and press Ctrl and S. Step A of the first step is to do 2 read-throughs, 1 unilingual and 1 comparative in whichever order you think best. Step B. Do a single comparative check. Do not stop for style changes. That is the problem in smoothing, tailoring, and sub-language. Then, correct only gross language errors if found. Do not use these procedures if working into your second language. You have more need than native speaker to do a separate reading for language only. And step C, do a single reading of the translation for the content, language, and presentation parameters. Look at the source text only if this is necessary to clear up a logic problem. Step D is to check presentation and mechanics. Also count paragraphs at least a point to ensure that there are no gross omissions. You may also want to pay special attention to correct reproduction of proper names, dates, or other figures, and with these procedures, you are essentially functioning as a proofreader. So, while revisers generally work through a translation from start to finish, many people check the front matter, including the title, summary, and table content last. This is especially common when revising the work of others, since the summary will make more sense once the reviser has become familiar with the text given. Also, the reviser needs to ensure that the table of contents reflects all the revisions made in the body of the text, especially if the automated table of contents features is not being used. So that's enough for section 3. And now let's move on to section 4, how to handle unsolved problems. What if the deadline is approaching? There's no time for further research, the author cannot be reached, or simply is unknown. and you have been unable to solve a problem. If creating a final version for delivery to the client is your job, then it is your duty as a professional to admit that you have failed to find a solution. A professional is not someone who knows all the answers. A professional is someone who knows how to go about finding answers, but if they fail, they admit it. Ask the client how the problem should be signaled. The translator's notes incorporated into the body of the text, translator footnotes, a separate page of notes, translator notes in the comment boxes, question marks, highlighting incorporated into the text. If the client do more work on the text before it goes to a printer or to readers, then highlighting or comments or a separate page of notes will often be acceptable. Similarly, if the text is being translated for information only, not for publishable purposes, then client may be quite happy to have question marks indicating uncertain passages. Otherwise, you will need to prepare a finished version with translator's notes. One difficulty with incorporating question marks is that they may be misinterpreted and misunderstood by the reader. If a doctor reading my translation of a medical text come across question mark no for any more encroachment, he or she may think I am not certain where there is such an impression as for any more encroachment. But that was not the problem. The problem was that I was not certain whether the source text author was in fact saying that there was no for any more encroachment. In such a case, you might use a comment function to distinguish term uncertain from meaning uncertain. Finally, remember that many clients do not want to spend a lot of time discussing problems in the translation. Clients who happen to be the author of the source text may be very happy, indeed anxious to do so, but many others will want you to handle the problems, and here are the 4 common situations. You understand the concept, but you cannot find the right way to express it in the target language. Write something which conveys the concepts, or take advantage of core text. If the translator has referred to do something called a blanking knife, and you cannot find any evidence for the existence of this term, perhaps you can write use an appropriate knife. If the text is one where correct terminology is important, signal your problem to your client. The second situation can be like this: you cannot decide which of the 2 interpretations is right. First, that is, write something which has both meanings. This can often be accomplished through an ambiguous syntactic structure. A certain word order or punctuation device will allow the sentence to bear both meanings. If fudging is not possible, or the text is one where fudging is unacceptable, provide both possible translations. Here is an example of using an incorporated translator notes. It is possible that helicopters will be used for, perhaps use of helicopter is permitted when fearing heart attack routine to the hospitals. And situation 3 is you cannot resolve a contradiction between different passages of the text. If you are sure the contradiction is a genius one, you must somehow indicate the problem. Otherwise, readers who know the text is a translation may wonder if the contradiction is due to the translator rather than to the source text author. And situation 4, you do not understand the passage at all. One solution is to make an intelligent guess. Here's an example using the question marks. He said that bonus was a secret to moving ahead. When using question marks, it is best to use 2 marks, one at the outset and one at the end of the uncertain passage, to signal the extent of the problem to the reader. It may also be a good idea to italicize the question marks or place them in square brackets or highlight them in color in order to distinguish them from indicators of interrogative sentences. Another possibility is to signal problems with literal or unidiomatic translation. Okay, so the conclusion here is, if the obscure passage is a complicated description of a natural or technological object or process, the solution may be to simply delete the description and refer the reader to an accompanying diagram or photograph. If the entire passages are obscure in their detail but clear in overall intent, you can sometimes substitute a summary for the full translation which appears in the draft. This approach, along with the omissions and fudging, will be necessary if the brief is to introduce and produce a text whose status as a translation is to be concealed. In that case, obviously, no alternative translations or translator notes will be possible. Let's come to section 5, the discussions on inputting changes. When corrections and improvements are made on paper, they have to be input on the computer. The question arises, who does this work and who is responsible for ensuring that it is done properly? There's no point in painstaking revision work followed by sloppy inputting of changes, right? So in other cases, changes may be input by the translator and the reviser, or a proofreader, or a member of the critical support staff. In large agencies, a particular approach to this task may be laid down by senior or local managers. Alternatively, it may be left up to the teams of translators who decide on a system. The important thing is to have a definite system with clear-cut responsibilities, and the best system, if it works, is to have the translator input the changes. That is because there is always a danger that the reviser who is less familiar to the text has unwittingly introduced errors. Now let's come to section 6 of this module, checking presentation. It is especially important if the revision falls at the end of the production process. There are always some common problems expressed in questions. Question 1 is, are there any section headings isolated at the bottom of the page? Question 2, are there any windows or orphans? Windows is the first line of a paragraph isolated at the bottom of a page, or orphans is the last line isolated at the top of a page. You may find that the window or orphan protection option in your word processor doesn't in fact prevent windows and orphans. So check this one correctly. Do not trust the computer entirely, right? And question 3, are there any unintentional blank or almost blank pages? The translator may have unintentionally introduced a hard page code that causes the next word to appear on a fresh page, or add tables or columns good, add some lines or points from lists indented more than others or less than others, add their pages where all the words are bolded, add the last few words of a footnote on the next page. Is the footnote indicator on the same page as the footnote? You might also want to check the legibility of the text. Of course, clients and readers can manipulate e-text themselves to make it legible, but they may find the need to do so annoying, or worse, they may receive printouts of hard-to-read text rather than the adjustable e-text. To make it easy for the reader's eye to follow the text, you should ensure that, first one, use a serif font. The font size is more than 10 points. The lines are not so too long. Long lines make it hard for the eye to keep its place when returning to the next line. When producing landscape text, use 2 or 3 columns in order to achieve shorter lines. The text is not full justified without added manipulation. Full justified text may have irregular spacing between words, and it is hard on the eyes. Check how your word processor handles justification. There may be no problem. If you do use full justification, make sure that it's turned off for the last line of the paragraph. Otherwise, this will happen. So, we come to section 7 right now, preventing the strategic errors. A considerable amount of correcting work can be eliminated if the translator avoids making strategic errors. What is a strategic error? It is a wrong decision about how to handle a certain category of translation problem. This decision then leads to multiple errors that cannot be quickly corrected with justify and replace function in Word. For example, suppose a new translator is working on a lengthy text that contains large numbers of names of organizations, companies, or committees in the source language. There are many ways such proper names can be handled, but it may be that some of them are not appropriate in the text at hand. It is therefore important to find out at an early stage how the translator is handling this issue. In the case of a contractor, you can send instructions about strategy along with the text. For example, leave all organization names in the source language, italicize them, and add a translation in brackets. So, finding out at an early stage, at the very start, how the translator is handling the issue. Okay, you need to decide very early on in the translation process how formal the writing should be and advise the translator accordingly. Now let's come to section 8. What is section 8 here? It is getting help from the translator. In many cases, you have to ask the translator to signal passages will be found especially difficult so that you can concentrate on these passages if your time is limited. And the translator should write a note or use an agreed upon mark to signal. And the last one here is the procedures, time saving and quality issues. There are methods of rules following from things that require judgment. Spelling is rule governed, but tailoring a text to the readers require judgments. In some cases, rules will replace judgment, and it takes less time to follow a rule than to make a judgment and act on, right? So every time you leave room for judgment, you increase production time. On the other hand, you probably also increase the number of error codes. That is the end of this module. I hope everything goes well with you. I hope that you can understand the lesson well, and thank you for watching my video.